Hi guys, we're going to be reading Chapter 9 of the Wee Freemen, Lost Boys. The moan rolled around the clearing, as mournful as a month of Mondays. Roar! It sounded like some animal in terrible pain, but it was, in fact, not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock, who was standing in a snowdrift with one hand pressed to his heart and the other outstretched theatrically. He was rolling his eyes, too. Oh! Och, the muse is a terrible thing to have happen to you, said Rob Anybody, putting his hands over his ears. Oh, it is, with great lamentation and much worrying dismay, the Pixie groaned, that we regard this doleful prospect of fairyland in considerable decay. In the air, the flying creatures stopped attacking and began to panic. Some of them flew into one another. With quite a large number of dreadful incidents happening every day. Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock recited. Including, I'm sorry to say, an aerial attack by the otherwise quite attractive Fae. The flyers screeched. Some crashed into the snow, but the ones still capable of light swarmed off among the trees. Witnessed by all of us at the same time, and celebrated in this hasty rhyme. Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock shouted after them. And they were gone. The eagles were picking themselves up off the ground. Some were bleeding where the fairies had bitten them. Several were lying curled up and groaning. Tiffany looked at her own finger. The bite of the fairy had left 2 tiny holes. It isn't that bad, Rob Anybody shouted from below. No one taken by 'em, just a few cases where the lads didn't put their hands over their ears in time. Are they all right? Oh, they'll be fine with some counseling. On the mound of snow, William clapped Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock on the shoulder in a friendly way. Now that, lad, he said proudly, was some of the worst poetry I've ever heard in a long time. It was offensive to the ear and just torture to the soul. Oh, the last couple of lines need some work, but you have the groaning off fine. All in all, it was a very commendable effort. We'll make a Gonagle out of you yet. Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock blushed happily. In fairyland, words really have power, Tiffany thought, and I'm more real, so I'm going to remember that. The pixies assembled into battle order again, although it was pretty disorderly, and then set off. Tiffany did not rush too far ahead this time. That's your little people with the wings, said Rob as Tiffany sucked at her finger. Are you happier now? Why were they trying to carry you away? Ah, they carry their victims off to their nest where their young ones... Stop, said Tiffany. This is going to be horrible, right? Oh, aye, gruesome, said Rob, grinning. And you used to live here? Aye, but it wasn't so bad back then. It wasn't perfect, mark you, but the Queen wasn't as cold in the old days. The King was still around. She was always happy then. What happened? Did the King die? No, they had words, if you take my meaning, said Rob. Oh, you mean like an argument? A bit, maybe, said Rob, but they was magical words. Forests destroyed, mountains exploding, few hundred deaths, that kind of thing. And then he went off to his own world. Fairyland was never a picnic, you ken, even in the old days. But it was fine if you kept alert, and there were flowers and birdies in summertime. Now there's the dromes and the hounds and the stinging fae and such stuff creeping from their own worlds, and the whole place has just gone down the tubes. Things taken from their own world, thought Tiffany as she tramped through the snow. So worlds were all squashed together like peas in a sack, or hidden inside one another like bubbles inside other bubbles. She had a picture in her head of things creeping out of their own world and into another, in the same way that mice invaded the larder. Only there were a lot worse things than mice. What would a drome do if it got into our world? Well, you'd never know it was there. It would just sit in the corner and you'd never see it because it wouldn't let you. And then it would just change the way you saw the world. It would give you nightmares and make you want to die. Her second thoughts added, I wonder how many already got in and we just don't know. And I'm in fairyland where dreams can hurt, somewhere all stories are real, all songs are true. I thought that was a strange thing for the Kelda to say. Tiffany's second thought said, hang on, go back to that first thought? And Tiffany thought, no, that was a third thought. I'm thinking about how I think about what I'm thinking about. At least, I think so. Her second thought said, all right, everybody, let's just calm down, please, because this is quite a small head. And the forest went on. Or perhaps it was a small forest and somehow it just moved around them as they walked. This was fairyland after all. You just couldn't trust it. And the snow still vanished where Tiffany walked, and she had only to look at a tree for it just to smarten up and make the effort to look like a real tree. The queen is, well, she's a queen, thought Tiffany. She's got a world all of her own. She could do anything with it. And then all she does is steal things and mess up people's lives. Then there was the thud of hoofbeats in the distance. It's her. What shall I do? What shall I do? The Nakmekfeagles leaped behind trees. Come away out the path, whispered Rob Anybody. She might still have him, said Tiffany, gripping the panhandle nervously and staring at the blue shadows between the trees. So, we'll find a way to steal him. She's the queen. You cannot beat the queen face to face. The hoofbeats were louder, and now it sounded as though there were more than one animal. A stag reappeared through the trees, steam pouring off it. It stared at Tiffany with wild red eyes, and then bunching up, it leaped over her. She smelled the stink of it as she ducked. She felt its sweat on her neck. That was a real animal. You can't imagine a reek like that. And here came the dogs. The first one she caught with the edge of the pan, just bowling it over. The other turned to snap at her, and then looked down in amazement as pixies erupted from the snow under each paw. It was pretty hard to bite anyone when all four of your feet were moving away from you in different directions. And then other pixies landed on its head, biting anything it could find over and over and over, and it just became impossible. Oh, the Nakmekfeagle hated grim hounds. Tiffany looked up at the white horse, and that was real too, as far as she could tell. There was a boy on it. Who are you? He said. He made it sound like, what sort of thing are you? Well, who are you? Said Tiffany, pushing her hair out of her eyes. That was the best she could do right now. This is my forest, said the boy, so I command that you do what I say. Tiffany peered at him. The dull second-hand light of fairyland was not very good, but the more she looked, the more certain she was. Your name is Roland, isn't it? You will not speak to me like that. Yes, it is. You're the Baron's son. I demand that you stop talking. The boy's expression was strange now, creased up and pink, as if he were trying not to cry. He raised his hand with the riding whip in it, and there was a very faint thwap. Tiffany glanced down. The Nakmekfeagle had formed a pile under the horse's belly, and one of them, climbing up on their shoulders, had just cut through the saddle's girth. She held up a hand quickly. Stand still, she shouted, trying to sound commanding. If you move, you're going to fall off your horse. Is that a spell? Are you a witch? The boy dropped the whip and pulled a dagger from his belt. Death to witches! He urged his horse forward with a jerk, and then there was one of those long moments, a moment where the whole universe seems to go, uh-oh. And still holding on to the dagger, the boy swiveled around the horse and he landed in the snow. Tiffany knew what would happen next. Rob Anybody's voice echoed among the tree. You're in trouble now, pal. Get him. No, Tiffany yelled. Get away from him. The boy scrambled backward, staring at Tiffany in horror. "No, I do know you," she said. "Your name is Roland. You're the Baron's son. They said you died in the forest." "You mustn't talk about that." "Why not?" "Bad things happen." "Well, they're already happening," said Tiffany. "Look, I'm here to rescue my—" But the boy had gotten to his feet, and when he was running back through the forest, he turned and shouted, "Stay away from me!" Tiffany ran after him, jumping over snow-covered logs, and she saw him ahead, dodging from tree to tree, and then he paused and looked back. She ran up to him, saying, "No, I know how to get you out," and danced. She was holding the hand of a parrot, or at least something that had the head of a parrot. Her feet moved under her perfectly, and they twirled around and around, and this time her hand was caught by a peacock, or, something with the head of a peacock anyway. She glanced over her shoulder, and she saw that now she was in a room. Oh, a ballroom full of masked people dancing. "Oh," she thought, "another dream. I should have looked where I was going." The music was quite strange. There was a kind of rhythm to it, but it sounded muffled and odd, as if it were being played backwards, underwater, by musicians who'd never seen their instruments before. And she hoped that the dancers were wearing masks. She realized she was looking out through the eye holes of one and wondering what she was. She was also wearing a long dress, which glittered. "Okay," she thought carefully. "There was a drone there, and I just didn't stop to look. And now I'm in a dream. But it's not mine. So it must make use of what it finds in your head, but I've never been to anything like this before." "Fwa, fwa, 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 fwa," said the peacock. The voice was like music. It sounded like a voice, but it wasn't quite. "Oh, yes, fine," said Tiffany. "Fwa, fwa, fwa, fwa." "Oh, woof, 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 woof," Tiffany answered. That seemed to work. The peacock-headed dancer bobbed a little bow and said, "Wah, wah, wah, wah," sadly, and he wandered off. "Somewhere in here is the drome," said Tiffany to herself, "and this must be a pretty big one, because this is a very big dream." Little things were wrong, though. There were hundreds of people in this room, but the ones in the distance, although they were moving in quite a natural way, they seemed to be just like the trees, blobs and swirls of color. You had to look hard to notice it, though. "Oh, first sight," said Tiffany. People in brilliant costumes and still more masks walked arm in arm beyond her, as if she were just another guest. Those who weren't joining the new dance were headed for the long tables at one side of the hall, which were piled high with food. Tiffany had seen such food only in pictures. People didn't starve on the farm, but even when food was plentiful, like Hog's Watch or after a harvest, it never looked like this. Farm food was mostly shades of white or brown. It was never pink and blue, and it certainly didn't wobble. There were these things on sticks and things that gleamed and glistened in bowls. Nothing was simple. Everything had cream on it, or chocolate swirls, or thousands of little colored balls. Everything was spun or glazed or added and mixed up. This wasn't food. It was what food became if it had been good and then went to food heaven. And it wasn't just for eating. It was for show. It was piled up against mounds of greenery and enormous arrangement of flowers. Here and there, huge transparent carvings were landmarks in this landscape of food. Tiffany reached up and touched a glittering cockerel. It was ice and damp under her fingertips. There were others, too. A jolly fat man, a bowl of fruits all carved out of ice, a swan. Tiffany was, for a moment, tempted. It seemed a very long time since she had eaten anything, but the food was too obviously not food at all. It was just bait. It was supposed to say, "Hello, little kitty, eat me." "Oh, I'm getting the hang of this," thought Tiffany. "Whew, good thing I didn't think about cheese." And then there was cheese. Suddenly, cheese had always been there. Now, she'd seen pictures of lots of different cheeses in the almanac. She was good at cheese, and she always wondered what other cheeses taste like. They were far-away cheeses with strange-sounding names like Treble Wibbly, Waney Tasty, Old Arg, Red Runny, and the legendary Lanker Blue, which had to be nailed to the table to stop it from attacking all the other cheeses. Just a taste. Couldn't hurt anything, surely. I mean, it's not the same thing as eating, is it? I mean, after all, she was in control, right? She'd seen right through that dream straight away, hadn't she? So this couldn't have any effect now, could it? And well, I mean, cheese was just so tempting for anybody. Okay, the drone must have put the cheese in there as soon as she thought of it, but she was already holding the cheese knife. She didn't even remember picking it up. A drop of cold water landed on her hand, and it made her glance up at the nearest glittering ice carving. It showed a shepherdess with a saddlebag dress and a big bonnet. Tiffany was sure it had been a swan when she looked at it the first time. The anger came back. Oh, she had nearly been fooled. She looked at that cheese knife. "Be a sword," she said. After all, the drone was making her dream, but she was doing the dreaming. She was real, and part of her wasn't asleep. There was a clang. "Correction," said Tiffany. "Be a sword that isn't so heavy." And this time she got something she could actually hold. There was a rustling in the greenery, and a red-haired face poked out. "Psst," it whispered. "Dinna eat the canapes." "Well, you're a bit late." "Ah, well, it's a cunning old drome you're dealing with here," said Rob Anybody. "This dream wouldn't have let us in unless we was properly dressed." And he stepped out, looking very sheepish in a black suit with a bow tie. There was more rustling, and other pixies pushed their way out of the greenery. They looked a bit like red-headed penguins. "Properly dressed?" said Tiffany. "Aye," said Daft Woolly, who had a piece of lettuce on his head. "And these trousers are a wee bit chafing, if I don't mind telling you." "Have you spotted the creature yet?" asked Rob Anybody. "No, it's so crowded." "We'll help you look," said Rob Anybody. "The thing is, you canna hide if you're right up close, so you be careful, mind you. If it thinks you're going to whap it one, there's no telling what it'll try. So spread out, lads, and pretend you're enjoying the ceilidh." "What? Oh, do you mean that we should get drunk and fight and all that?" said Daft Willie. "Cravens, you wouldn't believe it," said Rob Anybody, rolling his eyes. "Nay, you puddin', it's a posh party, you ken. It means you make small talk and you mingle." "Oh, I'm a famous mingler. You won't even know we're here," said Daft Woolly. "Come on." Even in a dream, even at a posh ball, the Knack McFeagle knew how to behave. You charged in madly and you screamed, but politely. "Lovely weather for this time of year, is it not, you wee scunner? Aye, Jimmy, ha' you got no pomfret for an old pal? Oh, this band is playing divinely, I dinna think. Make my caviar deep fried, will ya?" Well, there was something wrong with this crowd. No one was panicking or trying to run away, which is certainly the correct response to an invasion of Knack McFeagle. Tiffany set off again into the crowd. The masked people at the party paid no attention either. That's because they're just background people, she thought, just like background trees. She walked along the room to a pair of double doors, and she pulled them open. There was nothing but blackness beyond it. So, the only way out was to find the drone. She hadn't really expected anything else. I mean, it could be anywhere. It could be behind a mask. It could be the table. It could be anything. Tiffany stared at the crowd, and it was then that she saw Roland. He was sitting at a table by himself, and it was spread with food, and he had a spoon in his hand. She ran over and knocked it to the floor. "Haven't you got any sense at all?" she said, pulling him upright. "Do you want to stay here forever?" And then she felt some movement behind her. Later on, she wasn't sure she heard anything. She just had known. It was a dream, after all. She glanced around, and there was the drone. It was almost hidden behind a pillar. "Are you all right?" she asked desperately, trying to shake him. Have you eaten anything?" "Fa, fa, fa," said the boy. Tiffany turned back to the drome. It was moving toward her, but very slowly, trying to stay in the shadows. It looked like a little snowman made out of dirty snow. The music was getting louder, the candles were getting brighter, and out on the huge dance floor, the animal-headed couples whirled faster and faster. The floor shook. Oh, this dream was in trouble. The Nack-McFeegle were running to her from every part of the floor, trying to be heard above the din. The drome came lurching toward her, pudgy white fingers grasping the air. "First sight," breathed Tiffany. She cut off Roland's head. The snow had melted all across the clearing, and the trees looked real and properly tree-like. In front of Tiffany, the drome fell backward. She was holding the old frying pan in her hand, but it had cut beautifully. Odd things, dreams. She turned and faced Roland, who was staring at her with a face so pale he may as well have been a drome. "It was frightened," she said. "It wanted me to attack you instead, so it tried to look like you and made you look like a drome, but it didn't know how to speak. You do." "You might have killed me," he said hoarsely. "No," said Tiffany. "I just explained it. Please don't run away. Have you seen a baby boy here?" Roland's face wrinkled. "What?" "The Queen took him," said Tiffany, "and I'm going to fetch him and take him home. I'll take you home too if you like." "You'll never get away," whispered Roland. "Well, I got in, didn't I?" "Well, getting in is easy. No one gets out." "Well, I mean to find a way," said Tiffany, trying to sound a lot more confident than she felt. "She won't let you," Roland said, starting to back away again. "Oh, please don't be so stupid," said Tiffany. "I'm going to find the Queen and get my brother back, whatever you say. Do you understand? I've gotten this far, and I do have help, you know." "Where?" said Roland. Tiffany looked all around. There was no sight of a single Nack-McFeegle. They just turn up whenever I need them," Tiffany said. It struck her that there was something suddenly very empty about this forest, and it seemed a lot colder, too. "They'll be here any minute," she said hopefully. "They got trapped in the dream," Roland said flatly. "But they couldn't have. I killed the drome." "It's a lot more complicated than that," said the boy. "You don't know what it's like here. There's dreams inside of dreams. There's other things that live inside of dreams. Horrible things. And you never know when you've really woken up. And the Queen controls them all. The fairy people, anyway. You can't trust them. You can't trust anyone. I don't trust you. You're probably just another dream." He turned his back and walked away, following the line of hoof prints. Tiffany hesitated. The only other real person was going away, leaving her with nothing but the trees and the shadows. And of course, anything horrible that was running toward her right through them. She called out. "Hello? Rob, anybody? William? Daft Willie?" There was no reply, not even an echo. She was alone, except for her heartbeats. Well, of course she fought things and won, hadn't she? But the Nack-McFeegle had been there, and somehow that had made it easy. They never gave up. They would attack absolutely anything, and they didn't even know the meaning of the word fear. So Tiffany, who had read her way through the dictionary, had a second thought there. Fear was only one of the 1,000 words that those pixies probably didn't know the meaning of. Unfortunately, she did know what it meant. She knew the taste and the feel of it, too. She felt it now. She gripped the pan. It didn't seem quite such a good weapon anymore. The cold blue shadows between the trees seemed to be spreading out, and they were the darkest ahead of her, where the hoof prints had led. Strangely enough, the wood behind her seemed almost light and inviting. Someone doesn't want me to go on, she thought, and that was quite encouraging, actually, but the twilight was misty and it shimmered unpleasantly. Anything could be waiting. She was waiting too. She realized she was waiting for the Knack McFeegle, hoping against hope that she'd hear a sudden cry, even a "Crivens!" She was pretty sure it was a swear word. She pulled out the toad, which lay snoring on the palm of her hand, and she gave it a prod. "What?" he croaked. "I'm stuck in this wood of evil dreams, and I'm all alone, and I think it's getting darker," said Tiffany. "What should I do?" The toad opened one bleary eye and said, "Leave." "That is not a lot of help." "Best advice there is," said the toad. "Now put me back. This cold makes me lethargic." Reluctantly, Tiffany put the creature back in her apron pocket, and her hand touched Diseases of the Sheep. She pulled it out and opened it at random. There was a cure for the steams, but it had been crossed out in pencil, and written in the margin, in Granny Aging's big, round, careful handwriting, was, "This don't work. 1 dessert spoonful of turpentine will do." Tiffany closed the book with care, and she put it back gently, so as not to disturb the sleeping toad. And then, gripping the pan's handle tightly, she stepped into the long blue shadows. Wait, how do you get shadows when there's no sun in the sky? She thought, because it was much better to think about things like that than to think about all the other much worse things that she could. But these shadows didn't need light to create them. They crawled around on the snow of their own accord, and they backed away when she walked toward them, and that at least was a relief. But they all piled up behind her. The shadows were following her. So she turned and stamped her foot a few times, and they scurried off back behind the trees, but she knew that they would be flowing back as soon as she wasn't looking. She saw a drome in the distance ahead of her, standing halfway hidden behind a tree. So she screamed at it, and she waved her pan threateningly, and it lumbered off quickly. And when she looked around, she saw 2 more behind her, a long way back. The track led uphill a little bit, into what looked like a much thicker mist. It glowed faintly, so she headed for it. There was nowhere else to go. When she reached the top of the rise, she looked down into the shallow valley, and there were 4 dromes in it, big ones, bigger than any that she had seen so far. They were sitting down in a square, with their dumpy legs stretched out in front of them. Each one had a gold collar around its neck, attached to a chain. Tame ones? Tiffany wondered aloud. But who could put a collar around the neck of a drome? Only someone who could dream as well as they could. Well, we tamed sheepdogs to help us herd sheep, she thought, so the queen uses dromes to herd her dreams. In the center of the square formed by the dromes, the air was full of mist. The hoof tracks and the tracks of Roland led down past the tame dromes and into the cloud. Tiffany spun around, and the shadows darted back. There was nothing else nearby. No bird sang, nothing moved in the woods. But she could make out 3 more dromes now, their big, round, soggy faces peering at her behind tree trunks. She was being herded. At a time like this, it would be nice to have someone around to say something like, "No, that's too dangerous. Don't do that." Unfortunately, there wasn't. She was going to commit an act of extreme bravery, and no one would ever know if it all went wrong. And that was frightening. But it was also really annoying. That was it. This place annoyed her. It was all so strange. And it was the same feeling she had when Jenny leaped out of the river. Out of her river. This queen had taken her brother. Maybe it was selfish to think like that, but at least anger was better than fear. Fear was just this damp, cold mess, but anger had an edge to it. She could use that. They were herding her like she was some kind of sheep. Well, one angry sheep could send a vicious dog away, whimpering. So, 4 big dromes sitting in a square. This was going to be a big dream. Raising the pan to shoulder height to swipe at anything that came near, and suppressing a dreadful urge to go to the toilet, Tiffany walked slowly down the slope, across the snow, through the mist, and into summer.